I guess you guys didn't hear that jQuery's dead. You must be in the wrong room. This is not the Angular session. Anyone need to leave? Gosh, I thought they got a big room. When I first saw the room, I didn't think there'd be this very many people who'd attend this. So I guess jQuery's alive and well. And if you feel like you're in the wrong room at any point, please feel free to leave. I don't want anyone to stay here out of politeness. This isn't necessarily the topic for every person. So if you feel like your time's spent better somewhere else, feel free to leave quietly just for the others. I won't mind. My name is Mike Scalora. I've been coding in Utah County for almost 25 years. I came out here to work on WordPerfect for the Commodore Amiga. It's probably, some of you are younger than when it was canceled, born after. And I've been doing contract work for the last 4 years, which means I've seen a lot of code bases because I come into companies that have a lot of existing code and work on those. And I came up with this talk based on my exposure to a lot of different code bases over the last 4 years, besides the few before that. I worked at Intuit for a long time, worked at WordPerfect, Novell, Corel, those kinds of places. Although mostly the jQuery work has been in the last 4 years. Who's this for? It's intermediate jQuery. This isn't an introduction to jQuery. I expect that you've seen jQuery before, that you know what a selector is, and have some exposure to it. So I won't start at the very beginning. If you're a person who doesn't do a lot of front-end work, but just has to jump in and do a little bit now and then, this is a good person for this presentation, because I'll kind of help you understand some things that are you don't always learn when you just dabble in jQuery. Who's this not for? Where's my heckler? I saw him come in. I'm not going to talk about jQuery UI or jQuery mobile specifically, but I will talk about the core jQuery, which you'd use if you're doing those probably. And if you're a jQuery veteran expert, then you'll probably be bored. So this may not be for you, but you'd probably learn something just on my some of the topics I'll cover. The goals are for you to be able to improve your skill as a jQuery programmer, have a little better quality code, do better in code reviews. That's what I hope you all will get out of this. Where does this come from? As I mentioned, I've been doing contract work. So I go into these organizations that have existing code base. I've worked with a lot of guys who are back-end web engineers, and they try to write some jQuery, and I do a lot of code reviews. I help people. And then I have other people reviewing my code, and I learn from that too. And then I did some investigation to make sure I wasn't giving you bad advice today. Here's the sections. I'm not going to go over those because you'll see them if I can possibly talk fast enough to get to all of them. First, I am going to mention the jQuery philosophy, because I think it's important in understanding how you should be writing jQuery. The tagline that you see on the logo now is "Write less, do more." So you should think to yourself, if you find yourself writing the same code over and over again, long bit of code to do something, that you're probably not doing it the best way. Either there's probably a part of jQuery that you don't know about that does that, or you should write a plugin to simplify that. And plugins shouldn't be scary to write yourself. Message sending is a great way to write more modular code that's decoupled. Instead of calling functions back and forth, you can send events, custom events. Besides the DOM events, jQuery's got great support for creating your own events. So that's an important part of it. Chainability, I'm going to talk about, is right there in the philosophy slide on the jQuery site. And something that's become less important but still there is normalizing browsers. It used to be when you wrote DHTML, in the old days we used to call it that, before Ajax was coined, you'd spend a lot of time writing hand-coded if statements. If I'm in this browser, do this thing, and if I'm in that browser, do the other thing. So jQuery helps you if you use the jQuery methods to do something. They generally take care of the browser differences for you. Although as the various browsers support standards better, this is a less important part of jQuery, but still there. Terminology, a jQuery object. The $sign is not the jQuery object. That's the jQuery function. And you use the jQuery function with a selector and it returns a jQuery object. This third sub-bullet point here is important, and it'll help you if you really keep it in mind that jQuery objects hold 0 or more elements. A lot of people think it holds 1. I've seen lots of code that checks to see whether the jQuery object is null or undefined to tell whether it succeeded in finding an object, and that doesn't work because it's like a collection. There's always an object there. The jQuery function always returns a valid object. It's just sometimes it's an empty collection. And I put here that it acts like an array because it is not a JavaScript array, but it has some of the same things that arrays have. It has a length property, and that's the way you test whether your query found any elements or not. That's pretty simple stuff, but keep that in mind. Sometimes when we're writing jQuery code, we forget that it could have found more than one element. And once in a while I see bugs caused because there's an assumption it's 1, always 1, or 0 or 1, but sometimes it can be more than 1. And then a command is a term that used to be an important part of jQuery. It's just a method on the jQuery object. It's a more specific name than a method. It's a command. So you'll hear me talk about, call this command and that command. Those are just the methods on the jQuery object. There's another kind of method, which is utility methods. So if you've ever done an AJAX call or a GET call in jQuery, those are utility methods. They're called right on the jQuery function. So they're actually methods of a function object. It makes more sense. It's harder to describe than to use, but when you see $.ajax, you're using a utility method, and that's what they're called. And then selectors, if you've been exposed to jQuery, you know what those are. jQuery selectors have more stuff in them than CSS selectors. It's a subset of what CSS has. There's lots of fancy stuff in there. I find good, solid jQuery code doesn't use too many of those special, complicated selectors. Most of the time we're doing stuff like IDs and classes, and then we're using some of the pseudo selectors like focus and click or checked, those kind of things, and use them in combination. One thing I'll mention, though, that I see people are unaware of is you can use commas in selectors. A comma is like an or. So if I have .class, comma, .class, that says I want all of the elements that have either of these classes. Now jQuery will give you all of those elements. It will not have duplicates if one element has both classes. It creates a single list, like a set, and it's in document order, regardless of where things appear You can have a lot of commas, but it'll always give you that complete set, kind of the union of all those. If you divided the selector where the commas were, selected on those and took the union of them and put them in document order, that's what you get. So don't forget about the comma in selectors. Chaining, just calling multiple commands on the jQuery object. So what's happening, which isn't always obvious, is each command returns a jQuery object, and the next command is just running on the result of the previous command. So you're not quite really calling them all on the same jQuery object. You're calling them in turn on the result of the previous command. But one thing that I see when someone just dabbles in jQuery is they forget they can chain, and they use a lot more temporary variables to hold the jQuery object and to call the next command and the next command. And I see long lists of calling commands one at a time where they could be chained together, get a little better performance, reduce the code, write less. So keep that in mind. My conventions just in this presentation are when I have a command, I put that the period at the beginning, so you just know I'm talking about a command in the slide if I do that. The rest are pretty obvious. The ellipsis isn't some special part of JavaScript you didn't know about. I just mean any parameters when I put that in the slide. So one case where I see some issues in jQuery code when I'm doing a code review is because the programmer just doesn't know what all is in jQuery. So they start writing code. There's hundreds of ways to do some of the same operations, and you can write, people drop into the DOM and start accessing DOM properties unsafely because they don't realize they could be null or undefined, and so they get into trouble doing it the wrong way. And the right way is to use the jQuery command that does that, and some things just aren't named that well. But in order to help you in general understand what's in jQuery, I want to point out some things about the API. And that's that many of the methods in jQuery have getters and setters using the same command based on overloaded parameters. Text and HTML, if you've used jQuery much, you know that you can both get the text out of an element with text, and you can also set the text in an element. And it just depends whether there's that extra parameter there, which one it does. All of these other ones do the same thing. Probably most surprising of these is the width and height. Many people don't know that you can set the width and you can set the height with those commands. They aren't just getters, they are also a setter version based on that overload. In this example right here, let me use my fancy laser pointer, virtual laser pointer. In this example, you see I'm using the val command both as a getter inside the expression and a setter in the same statement, because I'm going to append to it. So you get used to this, that if you look up a lot of things that would make sense to be a getter and a setter, you'll find they are. There's more than the ones I've listed here. So keep that in mind. Check the documentation if you're not sure. Keep in mind also that getters don't chain. Because I'm getting some kind of data type like a string or a Boolean or something like that, I can't chain past the getter. I can only chain on commands that return the jQuery object, which is almost everything except the getters. And think about when you're chaining or not chaining, could I order things differently? Can I set the CSS property and then get the value out of it? That's often possible and prevents you from breaking the chain and using a temporary variable or running a query twice. So keep that in mind. And the one that I haven't talked about yet, has class, is the way we test for classes. And it returns a Boolean. It's a getter only. There's 4 big class commands in jQuery: add class, remove class, has class, and the little used toggle class, which is one of my favorite jQuery commands, because it's got some, and then there's 2 versions of it, which I'll talk about later, why it's my favorite. We'll talk about it now. How about toggle? This concept of toggling is there's not a ton of toggling in jQuery, but you should look for it, and it's important because it saves you a lot of code. A lot of times I'm doing a code review and someone's saving the state of something, or they're getting it and inverting it and setting it, and you really should be doing something like a toggle. And there's a good place where you might add your own plugin to toggle something. But this toggle class command is especially useful for when I'm turning stuff on and off. And I mentioned there's 2 forms of it because it takes an optional second parameter of a Boolean. So the first form, without the Boolean, it checks whether the class, that element has the class, and adds it if it doesn't and removes it if it does. But the second form takes the Boolean and will just force it to the state you want. So sometimes you'll have a function, a parameter's coming in, and I'll see programmers write if statements. If the parameter is true, then I show, or I add class, and if it's false, then I remove class. You don't need to do that. You can just pass that Boolean into toggle class, and it'll set it the way you intended without having that if in there. So again, one statement instead of those 3 to 5, depending on how you indent. Same thing with just plain old toggle, which does a show hide. So there's a show command and a hide command in jQuery you might have used, which do stuff like set the display CSS property for you. Toggle will make it appear and disappear, and a toggle with a Boolean will force it to the state you want. So don't forget about those. They save a lot of code, save a lot of typing. I mentioned command chaining.
Mike,
oh, go ahead.
Can you go back real quick and just talk briefly about fade toggle and slide toggle?
Fade toggle and slide toggle. So there's fade in, fade out. And so fade toggle just does those operations based on what, the state that it's currently in. So like toggle does show hide, fade toggle does it for fade in, fade out. And slide toggle, there's a slide animation, and so it'll make it slide back and forth. It kind of keeps track of the state of it for you. Oh, and I should have mentioned the animate one at the bottom. I actually discovered this when I was creating this slide. I went and looked at the documentation to see whether there's any more toggle functionality I could mention. So you can actually pass the value toggle in an animate. I don't have time to explain animate if you're unfamiliar with it, but you can pass toggle in for just about any measurement and opacity property. And so if you're doing an animate across several properties, you can throw toggles in there and it'll toggle those. So this outline width, if you have an element that has an outline of say 10 pixels and you run this animate on it, that outline will shrink and disappear, and you call it again and it'll go back to 10 pixels. Now the magic is it kept track of that it was 10 pixels before it toggled it the first time, and you don't have to do that. Not terribly useful for outline width, but for something like a margin where you're moving an element using the margin, that would be more useful. It'll keep track of what the margin was when you call toggle again.
Will that be true for things like hide auto? So like you have an automatic height for your...
I just discovered this when I searched through the documentation, but that's a good question. I suspect it would, but I don't know for sure. Investigate that and report back to the group. Command chaining, I talked about this already just really quickly. It's efficient both in typing code and performance-wise to chain your commands together. And so this is kind of an example. I like to indent when there's a navigation, like the parent command here. And then I'm showing that these others are running across the parent of the element I had expected the first ones to run off. That's pretty standard stuff. Just get used to chaining. It's cool and efficient, and all the kids are doing it now. Here's some advanced chaining. Now, you don't run into this a ton, but there's a special command called end. And remember I mentioned that not everything's named to make it obvious what it does. So end has this mechanism in jQuery objects, so there's kind of a stack of the state of a jQuery object. And when you call certain commands, find is one of them, filter is another one, has is another one. Again, a name that doesn't have a lot of meaning. It makes sense when you say it and you know what it means, but when you're trying to learn it doesn't make a lot of sense. But what happens is the state of the jQuery object kind of gets pushed on a stack when you do a find. Then you run some commands on the new jQuery object that you found. And then you call end, and it pops that stack and it restores the jQuery object to what it was before the find. So find runs a selector on the descendants of what's in the jQuery object. So you're often doing something like I get the container of a list. I do a find to get the elements of the list. I do something to them. Say I reset a class or I uncheck the checkboxes. Then you can call end to get back to the container and do something to the container. Filter is another of these similar kinds of manipulating the collection commands. It lets you take a set of DOM elements and eliminate some of them based on a selector, or there's other versions where you can use a function to eliminate those.
So does the chaining make the debugging difficult?
It can, because it's all one statement, but I don't find that to be too much of a problem, but it can be. But what I can do when I'm debugging, if it's confusing me a little bit, is to stick in a temporary variable, debug through, and then take that temporary variable out after I figure out what's wrong. And I mentioned there's also a has command, which does some filtering based on whether an element's descendants match a selector. It's kind of a complicated one. It's not used a ton, but it will also respond to the end to restore the jQuery object back to what it was. This is advanced. This is like ninja chaining. Did you have a question?
Does end work with parent?
I don't think so. I think it just works with these more filtering type, but I haven't. Not sure. So tricky bits. This is a few things that I find that people get wrong a lot. These aren't the trickiest parts of jQuery, but things that tend to trip people up. And it's not because they're bad programmers, but it's because it's a hard concept, or it looks like the right way to do it, and they do that, and it turns out the wrong way to do it. So I thought I'd mention these. The first one, and this is one I see a lot, it surprises me, but it's not uncommon to see this. And that's when people think HTML and text do the same thing. And in some circumstances, they do the same thing. If I have a name in a variable and I call text to insert it into an element, I can use HTML and it does it right most of the time. The important distinction is that the parameter you pass to HTML is HTML source. It's properly encoded source. It has entities for ampersands and less thans and greater thans. And that's not true of the parameter to text. The parameter to text is text. It's a string. It's not encoded. And jQuery in the browser are going to encode it for you. And the way I see this misused most often is when someone takes an untrusted string of text and they use HTML to insert it into an element. And it gets through and it turns into a bug in production because it works until you type in a script element in your address field. And then it inserts a script element, and HTML will make it a script element in the page, and you can run scripts with it. One of the tests I like to run on websites is typing in script, and then I alert, and this is a bug, and end script, and then I put that in all the fields, and I submit it, and then sometimes it's on the server side, but sometimes it's in jQuery, and sure enough, an alert will pop up on the page because they inserted it with HTML instead of text. There's also another command like HTML called append. It's used sometimes. I don't see it as this bug with that as much, but it does the same thing as HTML, except it sticks it on the end of the contents. But it's similar. It's expecting properly encoded HTML, not a string. So be careful with that one. That by far and away is the most common mistake I see for people who aren't full-time jQuery programmers make. This next one is a mistake that I'm guilty of for a long time. And this has to do with people who started using jQuery a long time ago. And unfortunately, it's perpetuated because all the blog postings and all the answers on Stack Overflow get this wrong. Because they're from the olden days before we knew better and we started using prop. Prop and attribute sound like they do the same thing, except, this is important, attribute is really should only be used when you want to change the HTML source. Prop is for changing the property of a DOM object. Most people learn about prop when they try to deal with checkboxes because they want to get the state or set the state of a checkbox. An attribute absolutely will not work for that. It doesn't work. It used to work in old versions of jQuery, but the current versions it doesn't work. You'll call attribute till the cows come home and it won't change the checkbox, or it won't get the current state of the checkbox. You have to use prop because prop's looking at the DOM object's properties, hence the name, and attributes looking at the attribute in the HTML source. Now, we used to only have attribute. That's all we used. And so lots of people got into the habit of using it, like me, and we just keep using it. And we shouldn't. There's the conventional wisdom now, and you can read these long debates on Stack Overflow and some of the comments. But I think the good advice is don't use attribute at all unless prop won't work. Use prop for everything. And then when that doesn't work and you find out I'm really trying to generate source and I'm going to extract it and give it to somebody to paste into a text editor or something I've never done, then you want to use attribute. there are a couple places that I've used attribute recently that have to be attribute, but they're so esoteric it'd take me 10 minutes to explain why you do that. So the important message here is use prop, use prop, use prop. And if you see someone using attribute in a code review, ask them why are you using attribute. And if they don't have a good reason, it's probably wrong. Yes?
Wait, from what I got, the only benefit of using prop is for checked and disabled. What's the other benefit?
Well, there's lots of things that aren't attributes, but there is a DOM property value. And there's things where there are DOM properties that don't have the same value as the attribute. But I ask you, why use attribute? Do you really want what's in the downloaded source file, or do you want the current state of the DOM object? Because prop is the current state of the DOM object. It's not the HTML source that got downloaded. Now you'll find that attribute actually has magic code in it. There's tons of conditional code that's like deprecated behavior where it'll go update DOM properties when you're setting it, but don't rely on that. That stuff will go away eventually, probably, hopefully. But prop is really, if you're talking about the current state of an element's DOM object, you really want to use prop. Unless you're going to render the source of the document or something like that. But for example, the href, browsers do things like resolve relative paths in hrefs, and so you can get the full absolute path out of an href by using prop and the right property. Sometimes you might want the original relative path instead, so there's a place you might use attribute, but my recommendation is use prop all the time until you run into a spot where you really have to use attribute. Don't depend upon the special casing of certain properties that attribute does historically. Have I convinced you?
Yeah. You gave more.
I'll see you after class. I don't like your attitude. No, I'm kidding. Modern Event API. I'm on a personal crusade to stomp out bind and unbind. Unfortunately, because the internet has all these pages that were done years ago, it's still everywhere. And because plugins support old versions of jQuery, they still use bind and unbind. But bind and unbind are no longer recommended. They aren't deprecated yet. It's not that strong. I think they should be because we got to stomp it out. But bind and unbind have been replaced by on and off. And really click and load and submit and all those event-specific commands are really not the best practice. You should use on and off and one, the seldom used one, to bind and unbind your events. And on and bind are very similar. They have two overloads that are pretty much the same. But on has another overload, which I'm going to talk about. And they do similar things. Off is just like unbind, has the same support for namespaces and stuff. One is an interesting way. It says, I want to get the next event of this type, but only the next event. So it lets you bind for one event only. That's the one event only. Those are the best practice. I'm stomping it out every time I go into code now, because in my projects, I'm usually coding to a specific version of jQuery. I don't have to support bind like a plugin does. So I just go in and fix all those binds and clicks and submit commands, and I change them all to ons and offs and ones.
Well, if they're the same, if they're virtually the same, why were they replaced?
I think there was an effort, kind of like promises. Have you heard about promises? To unify the APIs across libraries, so they're all very similar. And so I think that was part of it. Other JavaScript libraries use the on-off terminology. And as I mentioned, on has a magic special overloaded feature. So you don't really want to use bind here and on here. Just get used to using on.
Another benefit of using on is that instead of passing in a single thing like click, like you have there, you can pass in an object, and each method of the object is a different handler. So you can have click, mouse over, mouse end, and have a function attached to each one of those. Makes the code a lot more organized.
So another overload that improves the API a bit. The overload I'm going to talk about. Oh, I wanted to mention trigger. Trigger's the same, and there's a little known step cousin to trigger called trigger handler, which I've yet to actually make use of, so I won't bother explaining that. But it has a little bit different behavior. But if you want to send an event, you use trigger to send the event, one or more events, and it supports all the namespaces and all that cool stuff jQuery events have. And these work for your custom events. So you make up events willy-nilly and use on and trigger to handle those events, or attach handlers and to dispatch those events. But my advice: use on, off, and one. Get rid of bind and unbind, and stop using all these event-specific things. Lots of times I find people using the event-specific one when they really needed to attach to more than one event at the same time. How many people know that if you attach to resize event, you should probably also attach to orientation change event? So that's a common one. That resize doesn't do it. You really should do on, and you can specify a space-delimited string of multiple events to handle with one event handler. Orientations change, of course, comes when the iPad, you could turn it sideways and the screen changes. You don't get a resize event, you get an orientation change event. Delegated events. This is what I was talking about, the new overload. I shouldn't say new. The overload of on that bind doesn't have. You used to use something called live events. There's a delegate and a live command to attach events. Those are deprecated. Stronger than no longer recommended for bind and unbind. These commands have been deprecated. Not that many people used them, so it's not as big a deal. It's not as pervasive. But let me try to quickly explain what's going on here. We have two selectors. We have the first traditional selector. You may have a cached jQuery object, but then what you're doing is you're binding one or more events. That's the click here. And then you pass another selector as the second parameter, and then you pass your handler. So this could be a closure or a function name, something like that. What happens is when events bubble, so HTML DOMs, I don't have time to explain event bubbling, but when an event bubbles up, it bubbles from innermost element that the event went to, and it keeps bubbling up to parents. When it hits the parent that this jQuery object matches, it will try and apply this selector to the element that where the event originated. The target, yes. So you can imagine you might have a list display of rows, and the user clicks on one of the rows. and that event bubbles up to the container. So what I'd do is I'd put the container in this selector. So that would be my div that has the scroll bar. And whenever that click, then I'd put something like a .row selector. That would be my row in the list in this second selector. And I attach one handler to one element, one handler on one element, and that will handle all those clicks on every row. Well, that's pretty cool. You're saving, attaching a handler to all of those different elements. That's one benefit. But the other benefit is if I add rows later, I don't have to do anything to handle the events on those new rows. Normally, when I bind handlers to elements, any elements added later, even if they match that selector that I ran a while ago, they don't get the handler by magic. I have to write code to say, oh, I added another row, let me attach the click handler to it. Oh, I added another row, let me attach the click handler. And so you end up writing code to go update the handlers, and you got to make sure you're not putting them on elements that already had the handler, and you end up doing all these gyrations, and you have bugs because you didn't do it right. Well, delegated events, I don't have to do that. I attach one handler to one element, the container, and it handles the click events on all of those sub-elements that match the selector, the second parameter of the on. It's pretty cool. It's always been, it's been in jQuery a very long time using live and delegate, but it's a more standard feature, and it's one that isn't used nearly as much as it should be. So this probably wasn't a long enough tutorial to really understand it, but know that it's in there and go read about it and use it in your code. Yes?
It's also super useful when you bring in new elements that might need listeners attached to them. If they're delegated to a parent element, then you don't worry about it.
Yeah, exactly. It's smaller, faster, better. You write less code. Who wouldn't love delegated events? I don't know. Okay, here's a problem I see, and this is something that typically crops up later when someone's adding more features to a project down the road. And I see this in websites. Even when I go visit the site, I know it's happening. And I'll tell you why I know that. Events, when you're done handling them, should be terminated. Because the normal thing that your browser does is keep bubbling events. If you use links to do actions in your page, you're probably aware of this because you have to deal with those. Because if you don't terminate the event, your page navigates to another page usually, unless you have something special in the href. And that's why I know programmers aren't always terminating their events, because people put hashes, pound signs, in the href. And when the user clicks on it, they handle the event, but they don't terminate it. So that pound sign ends up going up in the address bar on the end of the URL. And so whenever you see you're on a page and you click on something and something happens, and then you end up with a hash on the end of the URL, someone forgot to terminate the event. It's a little unsightly, but it ends up causing problems sometimes where someone wants to handle clicks on other elements and events are bleeding through. The easiest way to terminate events is to return false from your handler. Returning false from a handler, from an event handler, is the same as calling both prevent default and stop propagation. Prevent default is telling the browser, don't do what you normally do for a click on this element. Stop propagation says, don't bubble this event to the parent anymore. I handled it. I took care of it. So returning false does both of those. Sometimes you need some behavior that's a little weird, like you don't want the default, but you do want the bubbling, and so you can just call those methods. Those are methods of the event object that your handler's passed. So you have to put a parameter in your handler and call those on the event. Or I actually think there's a global that holds the current event, but I don't ever use that. But terminating events is good practice. It keeps those unsightly hashes off your URL. I recommend doing it, and you'll not have as many bugs in the future when you add some other feature that breaks because of your unterminated event. This is more a matter of style than a real bug. Although I do see bugs time to time caused by this problem. And that's using tons of inline styles or programmatically applied styles when you are changing the visual appearance of elements. And it often creeps in insidiously, like the designer, the UI guy on your project says, when this happens, I want this element, the color to change. And so you go, okay, well, I'll just put a CSS and I'll change the color. And then someone says, no, I want it to be underlined too. And so you add that, and now you get two. And then they're like, no, let's put a border around it, and let's have the fancy color on the border and the background and change. And suddenly you have this giant list of CSS properties you're applying to the element. Worse yet is when you want to change it back to what it was before, it's hard to do. You have to sometimes save what all those were. Are we?
Just give like
1 minute? Whew. So you have to remember what all these property values were before you change them. And then so you can toggle it back and forth. And it just becomes a nightmare of maintaining styles. The place where it becomes a bug occasionally is because when you're setting a style programmatically, you're making it an inline style. And it overrides everything. And we have, there's pseudo selectors in your style sheet for hover and for focus and for things like that. And now you're fighting between inline styles, and your CSS guy's putting bang important on rules, and it's just mayhem. So the solution to this is easy. Use a class. Put the styles in the style sheet where they belong. They're presentation information. They belong in the style sheet. Just create a style, a more specific style that has a class like selected or something, and just toggle the class. So when the visual appearance changes, I add a class, and when it should change back, I remove the class, and let the browser do the work of sorting out the styles in the style sheet to make it look the way it ought to look. This often simplifies code. It gets rid of a lot of typing in your JavaScript. It eliminates the need to preserve what the old styles were. It's just way better. And I don't see people doing it that much. But it's a kind of an obvious thing. If I had a class on there that made it look different, all I got to do is turn the class on and off, and it just changes the appearance back and forth. So I'm sure everyone's hungry, and I am out of time, so I'm going to stay up here and I'll answer questions as long as people have some.